My name is Lester Sharlach, and I'm here today on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. The date is August 30th, 2011. I have the pleasure today of interviewing Harriet Brinen at her apartment at Glenview House on Glenbrook Road in Stamford, Connecticut. And we will start with an interview. Good morning, Harriet.
Good morning, Lester.
Harriet, let's start off with talking about your childhood. Where were you born and where did you live?
I was born in the Bronx, and when I was 1 month old, my parents moved into an apartment on the second floor, level with the elevated IRT that ran past our windows just about 200 yards away, if that much. We were living there when Parkchester was built from a Catholic protectorate where cows and sheep grazed. And my father, even though we were quite poor, told us smilingly that we were rich because we had a fire escape. And all my friends in Parkchester didn't. So it was a wonderful childhood. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I was within walking distance of the temple. First it was in a row of stores, and then a formal conservative temple was built around the corner. At the age of 5, I started Hebrew school. Not because I wanted to, but my father said, the first year you'll go because I say so, and from then on it's up to you. Well, I had such a great time because I was the only girl in the class, and that made me kind of a celebrity, and I could also read faster than all the boys.
Read Hebrew?
Yes.
What years were these taking place?
This was, I entered Hebrew school in 1942, and by the time I was 12 years old, they had no more grades for me to participate in, so I was the 4th girl to be bat mitzvah. And I had a haftorah, which I chanted on a Friday night, conducted part of the service, and at the end I made a speech. The closing sentence was blessing my parents, and when I got to the part where I had to say, and my dear brother Joel, I couldn't get his name out, and the tears flowed.
Was this an Orthodox synagogue?
No, it was conservative.
Do you remember the name of it?
Temple Emmanuel at Parkchester.
Mm-hmm.
On Benedict Avenue. It was located between St. Helena's Roman Catholic Church on one end of the street,
Mm-hmm.
and opposite the Parkchester Baptist Church. We always thought the street should have been named Benediction Avenue instead of Benedict.
Backing up a little bit, were your parents born in the United States?
Both my parents were born in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, they made their respective pilgrimages to the United States in 1912. My father was 6 years older than my mother, but he had 2 siblings at the time. His father had already been in the United States for 2 years, and his father was a fruit peddler in Stamford when my father's mother packed up the children and traveled to via steerage to the United States, and Stamford was the first place that my dad lived.
So, I understand that what you're saying is that your grandfather came from Russia to Stanford?
My father came from Russia to Stanford after his father had been here for 2 years.
Do you have any idea what brought him here?
Yes. Aunt Stissy, who was part of the Stanford Plumbing Supply family, the Rothmans and the
Yeah.
Friedmans, that was the connection that brought them to Stanford. And my father lived on Henry Street. Sadly, his father died very suddenly of throat cancer. His mother wasn't even aware that she lost her husband at that time because she was in and out of what they then called sleeping sickness. The doctors suggested to my father and his brother that they schlep her to California where the climate could possibly cure her. His 2 sisters stayed with the DePina sisters, owners of a famous clothing chain. They took care of young women, and they schlepped my grandmother to California. The cure was not there for her. And they came back and lived in New York, where my father met my mother. But I have to add that eventually in 1961, when my husband accepted a job offer from American Cyanamid, my father said, "You have to let me take you around. I know the city so well." Okay. So we got to Stanford. We went to the Motor Vehicle Bureau, which was down on Grove Street at the time, not far from Agudah Shalom Synagogue. And we came out of the motor vehicle, and my father said, "Now we've got to go to a marvelous delicatessen." And we walked, and we walked, and we walked. And I said, "No." We reached Pacific Street by that time, and my father said, "Let's stop into this kosher meat market, and I'll ask." He approached the elderly gentleman behind the showcase, and in Yiddish he said, "Wie bist?" and he gave the precise name of the delicatessen that had been there 40 years before. And the elderly gentleman slapped his hand to the side of his face and he says, "Oy vey, mister, you've been away a long time." So that was my father's beginning of his showing us around. We got an apartment on Strawberry Hill, which is where my father said he played football when he lived in Stanford. The 2-room Elm Street schoolhouse was still in existence, and he was happy to see that. In 1977, we brought my parents here to live. My father saw them demolish Elm Street School, and as he's sitting in my car, he looked at me and he said, "You sure know how to hurt a guy." He was saddened to see it go. One other anecdote. As soon as we moved in 61, my father came to visit with my mother as frequently as he could. And whenever I had a native Stanfordite to introduce him to, that's what I would do. And they would reminisce. Our dry cleaner would come to the apartment and spend 2 hours talking to my dad. Well, one day we were at Newfield Swim Club, and I said, "Dad, here's somebody you'll want to talk to." I introduced him to the young man, They chatted. And my father said, you know, when I lived on Henry Street, he said, my mother suffered from sleeping sickness. He said, there was a young woman who used to check me out every time I would come in. She'd brush off my clothes because he was a ruffian. And she'd say, Barney, you don't want your mother, if she's alert today, to be upset that you were rolling in the mud. He said, how I wish I knew that Gussie were alive and well. Excuse me. Herb Zieselman said, she is, you're talking about my mother. You could have blown my father over with a sneeze.
Mhm.
It was eerie. So when they moved here in '77, it was completing the circle. It was a joy for us. It was a joy to have the children share their grandparents.
Well, getting back to your early, you told us about your childhood home.
Yes.
And where did you go to school?
Okay, I went to elementary school in Parkchester, and then I went to Music and Art High School. And I disappointed my piano teacher when I told her I was accepted for art, not music. My brother was an incredible musician, and he was there ahead of me, majoring in music. And my brother just retired after 45 years of being a professor at Boston University in musicology. I was in Boston a year ago when he was honored at their Symphony Hall, and it was great. After music and art, I went to Queens College, and that was wonderful because my best friend at Queens College coerced me into meeting her fiance's childhood friend. And our first date was 13 hours long. Fortunately, I didn't know that Jerry went home and told his mother that he had met the girl he was going to marry. And that was the start of a budding friendship that in a very short period of time became, an engaged couple. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that the subway was still going past the windows, and he wanted me to be making some of the calls. And in those years, the girl didn't call the fella unless you were engaged. So the noise enhanced our friendship.
So what year was that you were engaged?
We were engaged in 1958 and married in December of '58. He was in graduate school at the time, and it was the first time that I was away from home. I had never been to sleepaway camp. I lived at home going to Queens College. So he brought me to Penn State, and he was working on his doctorate in chemistry and earning $100 a month. Our rent was $95 a month. I was the big breadwinner at $140 a month.
What were you doing?
Well, I had a very lengthy interview with the superintendent of schools across the 7 mountains of central Pennsylvania. And because I was the wife of a transient, I was not deemed appropriate for the school system. So I worked for the International Geophysical Year and did some interesting research for them that carried us through the 2 years that we still had. That was another promise that he broke, Lester. He said, we'll be out of here in a couple of months. But graduate school never works out that way. And we had 2 years and 3 months of a glorious beginning to our marriage.
Mhm.
It was, we were visited by each mother. His mother came, and my mother came, and
You mentioned that in the evening, you worked on his thesis.
he worked on his thesis.
Mhm.
So that when our first anniversary approached and Jerry's mother called and asked something about watching something on television, we said, well, we don't have television. She said, you've almost been married a year and you don't have television. What do you do? So Jerry answered very quickly. He said, we study a lot. And of course, they sent us a little TV for our first anniversary.
Mm.
But it was a lot of studying, a lot of writing, and excuse me, you reminded me, Lester, it was before computers were available to graduate students for their own doctorates. So I did all the drawings, all the graphics by hand for Jerry of all his spectra. He was a molecular spectroscopist, and that was, so when he showed the final thesis in bound form to his dad kept it on the front seat of his taxi as he worked every day. And he finally said to Jerry, I only have one complaint about Harriet's drawings. And Jerry got very serious, and he said, what is that? He said, couldn't she smooth out those lines? So we truly worked together, and that was very special.
So now we reached the point where he's graduated, and where was his first job?
Well, his entire career was with American Cyanamid. It was his least lucrative offer, but it was the research he wanted to pursue. And he was always open to new avenues, and he was extremely creative, and he became internationally known for a lot of the things that he did. And this was what ultimately got him on their research ladder.
So that was on 1937 West Main Street
You
in
got
Stamford, Connecticut.
That's right. He was there for 38 years.
Mhm. And he was happy working there because he was doing what he liked to do.
The only time that he was unhappy was when they tried to press him to accept a managerial position. He said he could never fire anybody, and he needed to keep creating, which he did. And his wonderful sense of humor carried him through everything, whether, and you know, being married to me, you needed a sense of humor. I'll admit that readily. His sense of humor entered all his technical presentations. And when I would occasionally go with him to a symposium, people would come to me and say, you know, have you heard this lecture or that lecture? And they would begin recounting some of the jokes that they still remembered.
Yeah.
Fortunately, his sense of humor stayed with him through his Parkinson's and to the end.
Yeah. So he retired from Cyanamid when the symptoms of the Parkinson's were beginning to show
Well,
themselves?
I honestly believe that he was in denial
Mhm.
and that he didn't accept that he was being challenged by anything. But maybe subconsciously he sensed that something was happening, so that when the company began letting people go, he went to the management and he said, if you make me an offer of a good package, I will go and you can save somebody else from
Mhm.
being let go. And that was how he retired.
Where were you living when you first moved to Stamford?
We lived in Strawberry Hill. We had the now renting sign hanging from our 8th floor terrace. And it was a fun place to live.
What was the name of the complex you were in?
We were on Strawberry Hill Avenue,
Yeah.
and it was an 11-story double building.
Oh, 71 and 91.
Yeah, they were first building 91 when we moved in.
Mhm.
The only thing that was a little unsettling was that our bathroom in the apartment was the mirror image of the one on the other side. And I discovered one day that if you open the medicine cabinet, at the same time your neighbor opened his medicine cabinet, I learned that he had a yellow terry cloth bathrobe. You could see right through the razor slot to the other side, and you could hear
Yeah.
whatever was going on.
And how long did you live at that
We
71
lived
Strawberry Hill?
there for 7 years,
Mhm.
and then we moved to Lancaster Place. Feber and Lamke were putting up a small group of houses. They didn't have permission yet from the zoning board, but Jerry had heard about it, and he met Al Lamke in the woods at the site where the houses were going to go up.
Mhm.
And he called me at work, and he said, we'll talk about it when I get home. I just put a $10 deposit down on a house. You know, today it's unthinkable, but
You mentioned he called you at work. Where were you working?
that I was volunteering at the time. I was volunteering in the school system, as I did for many, many years.
And when were your children born?
Jeffrey was born in 1961.
Mhm.
The week we moved to Stamford, in March of '61, we moved into our apartment, we bought a car, and the Friday of that same week, my doctor told me I was expecting our first child. And that evening, Jerry said to me, I have a special favor to ask of you. And I said, what's that? He said, could we make next week a little less exciting than this week? So we met a lot of terrific people in Strawberry Hill.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned you were doing volunteer work.
Yeah.
What organizations were you volunteering for?
I was volunteering with the National Council of Jewish Women. I was volunteering in the schools. And
What type of volunteer work did you do in the school system?
well, I had my teaching certification. So I was doing a lot of one-on-one work with children. When our daughter graduated from high school, one of her classmates was on his way to college. I don't remember what school he was going to, but he found me in the West Hill Stadium after graduation, and he said, "Mrs. Brinen, I will never forget that I was in 6th grade when you taught me how to borrow in subtraction." He said, "I wouldn't be going to college today if you hadn't helped me." You know, you see the lights go on when you
Yeah.
do something with children, and it's very special.
You mentioned that you were also a den mother and a den leader.
Yeah, yeah. And I was also on the synagogue board for 3 years during a very tumultuous time.
I believe it's always tumultuous on that board.
Yeah, yeah. I remember my husband asking me when I would come home at 11:30 at night, overstimulated, he would say,
Yeah.
"Has a synagogue ever been named correspondent in a divorce case?" So I was also on the board of National Council
Mhm.
and of the Willard School PTA. And
When your parents moved to Stanford, did they move in with you, or did they have their own apartment?
I found them an apartment in Morgan Manor.
Mhm.
They were coming from a rent of $44 a month in the Bronx to a Morgan Manor rent. So that encouraged me to get a job to pay their rent. They became very active with the seniors, and the seniors at that time were meeting in Agudas Shalom. So I took part of a day each week and played the piano for the senior group, and they could sing the golden oldies.
Oh, sing along.
I remember Lil Rimland turning to a gentleman who had a very impressive voice, and she whispered behind me at the piano, she said, "If you'll be Nelson Eddy, I'll be Jeanette McDonald." And they were great.
You mentioned that you went to work at that time, and what was your occupation?
I became, I started out as a coder for a marketing research company. And I moved on to being a project director and eventually a vice president. I was there for 18 years.
What was the name of the company?
Evaluative Criteria Incorporated. Steve Daniels was the president and owner of the company. When my dad first started to show signs that he was not highly functioning, I can't describe it any other way, he was becoming difficult for my mom. I submitted my resignation to Steve Daniels, and he said, "I'm not going to accept it." He said, "Take whatever time you need and do what you need to for your parents." He said, "But I don't want you to wind up on the waiting list for the Jewish home before they get in."
Mhm.
And it was 6 years later that I retired, and so it was a blessing to have somebody who helped me retain my sanity. I was able to work and still serve my parents' needs.
At that time, were your parents at the Jewish home living?
No, they were living in Morgan Manor, but it caused me to take my dad for an evaluation. And it was the first time I had ever heard the word dementia used. So it was jarring. My dad was at the Jewish home for 6.5 years. My mom moved from Morgan Manor to the senior facility on Vine Road, Willard Manor.
Mhm.
The kids warned her because both kids went to Willard School, He said, "Grandma, your apartment is right near the principal's office, so you have to behave." And she thrived there until my dad passed away up at the home. And then she began to have her difficulties. And ultimately, she wound up at the Jewish home. She was losing her sight. And Lester, I believe that's where Elaine and I saw each other many times, visiting our
Yes.
families.
Elaine's mother was there for almost 9 years.
Yeah.
Well, now we're pretty much up to the late 90s, year 2000.
Yeah.
And what's your life like then?
Well, the joy in the late 90s was that we became grandparents. Our older child, Jeff, was married. He got his, I have to say happily, both children followed in their dad's footsteps. They each got PhDs in the sciences. Jeffrey's a chemical engineer, and Linda is an X-ray crystallographer. She's currently on a medical leave from University of California at San Francisco Medical School. So Linda, her husband, and 6-year-old Jared, whom you see there, are in California. Jeff, Chris, and their 2 sons are in League City, Texas, which is right near NASA Road. They live where the astronauts live, outside of Houston. And the children and grandchildren have given us a lot of joy. And so that's pretty much how we confined our traveling. Once Jerry retired, it was my mother who noticed one day that he was pushing her wheelchair at the Jewish home. She said, "Jerry, are you okay today?" And he said, "Why do you ask?" She said, "Your feet sound tired." She was the first one to spot his shuffling gait. And he was eventually diagnosed. He never had any tremors. He was eventually diagnosed with Parkinson's. And he thrived. We went to a support group for Parkinson's people every single week.
Where was that located?
That's part of Greenwich Hospital, and it met and it continues to meet every Tuesday at the Greenwich Civic Center. The people there were inspirational, and they helped each other with cautions about medications. Caregiving spouses had sessions together, so we talked about how we dealt with the illness. And the first day that we went for a meeting there, Sarah Walker came over to me. And she had our children in nursery school so many years before. And she looked at me. She was very challenged by her Parkinson's. And she looked at me and she said, "I saw your father at the Jewish home." This woman was so amazing that she could have remembered having met him when the kids were in nursery school and then spotted him later at the Jewish home. People like her were members of this support group, and I still volunteer with that group currently because they helped us through so much, and I continue to go back and try to offer them what I can.
Well, now we're up to the present time in your life,
Yeah.
and We're living here in a very beautiful setting in this apartment.
Thank you, Lester.
And what are your activities now?
Okay, my activities are, I'm sure I'm gonna leave out a few. I've joined the Jewish Historical Society, and in addition to the Parkinson's group, I am active on the hospital's first Patient and Family Advisory Council. And I'm
That's at
honored-
Stanford Hospital.
Yes, and I'm honored to be on it with you, Lester. This is the beginning of our third year. Hopefully this year we'll make some footprints on this committee. And interestingly enough, each child asked that I move closer to them. And I kept hearing my husband's words echoing in my head, don't make a choice between the children. I've been in Stamford over 50 years now, surrounded by friends, special friends who helped us through so much. And I fortunately am still active enough that I feel I can do some good in this community. So I'm not ready to pick up and go.
You mentioned that you've been here for over 50 years. So you've seen some dramatic changes
Yeah,
in the city and in the population.
and in the synagogue.
Yeah. So looking back, do you feel it was better in the past, or are things better now? Overall.
Overall, I think just based on the way I was raised, the philosophy that my dad had early on, teaching us how rich we were because we had fire escapes, which were certainly not symbolic of wealth. I feel that at each stage, there was so much good and so much to be grateful for that I can't make a judgment that it's better or worse. I have an awful lot right now that I think is wonderful, okay? Just as I had when we first moved in, when we were struggling to make ends meet, and lots of advances in the city. One major change in the synagogue when we first came, Jerry and I were able to sit together in the balcony of the synagogue. I wish I could still sit in a mixed congregation, but that's minor.
Yeah.
But it's so special to me to have that memory because not a lot of people do. The town has built up tremendously. They've done amazing things for seniors, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also active in the senior center at the government center. I'm a member of LIR, and I take classes there, and I had attended classes at LLI in Norwalk. So there's not much time to be bored, and that's a good thing.
That's a good thing.
Yeah,
And the technology we've seen,
yes.
I mean, it's so tremendous advances.
And medically, another interest that I developed was a wonderful coup that I got Jerry interested in were alternative techniques. I studied Reiki, and my technical scientist husband was very skeptical, and it wasn't until some small miracles took place that he said to me, I'm a believer. and I will go and study Reiki with you.
Could
So-
you give us a very short interpretation of what Reiki is? Because I
Okay.
think many people are not aware.
Okay, Reiki is a hands-on healing, similar to the therapeutic touch, in which energy is transmitted from the sender, I would be a sender, to a recipient to arrive at some positive results. The first level of Reiki is just hands-on and individual. And the second level of Reiki that I studied was the ability to send energy at a distance. And when I asked Linda's permission in California if I could send to her, because I didn't want to invade her space without her permission, she said, "Sure, Mom, knock yourself out. You know, in California, all these things are accepted." Well, the following Tuesday morning, 7:30 in the morning, I said to Jerry, "I'm going to go send to Linda." He said, "It's too early, stay in bed." I said, "No, I'm going to send and then I'll get back into bed." That was Tuesday. Thursday night, Linda called with a chemistry question for Jerry, and she never called during the week because of the 3-hour time difference. I answered the phone. She said, "Mom, stay on the phone. I need to ask you a question." She spoke to Jerry. They solved the chemistry issue. And she said, "Mom, are you there?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you happen to send to me on Tuesday?" I said, "I did." At that point, you could hear an edge in her voice as she said, "Mother, didn't you realize it was only 4:30 our time?" Jerry's on an extension, and he began to splutter, "But Linda, that's exactly when she sent to you." That was how he became a believer. Across 3,000 miles, it doesn't have to be palpable, but for her it was. And she specifically identified, you know, and
It's an amazing story.
and it also helped my mom at the Jewish home when they gave her 48 hours to live.
Mhm.
I whispered in her ear. She was already non-responsive. I said, "I can now send to you at a distance. All you have to do is think that you'd like me around you." And I said, "And I will be there for you." 2 weeks after the feeling that she was about to die, the head nurse called and she said to Jerry, "Is Harriet still sending to Pearl?" And he said, "Yes, why?" Well, the therapist went to her today and said, "Pearl, let's see if you can support your own weight." She had either been in bed or in a Jerry chair for the 2 weeks. My mom was helped up and she walked to the dining room and ate. The next day, I took the New York Times to the Jewish home. And because she was blind, what our practice had been, I would give her the clue, tell her how many spaces, and she would give me the answer. And she was doing that the following day. And this was a miracle. And she said, "I felt your energy around me all the time." So, who knows, Lester? It's like chicken soup.
Yeah.
It couldn't hurt. So, those are my activities.
Yeah. We spoke about your dad in an article that was written in the Greenwich Time.
Yeah.
And I'd like to show that article, and you can discuss it, what it's all about.
Okay. This in June of 1986, the Advocate and Greenwich Time published a special section in which they were commemorating the 100-year anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. And they went around to different senior locations and interviewed people regarding their experience, if any, with the Statue of Liberty. And my dad described his trip from when they escaped Tsarist Russia to come to the United States. And it was a beautiful tale. This same year that the family rode in a covered wagon to get past the Russian border to take a train that brought them to a ship. My mother was less than a year old, and she and her two brothers were hidden under a tarp with her parents, leaving Russia, making a pilgrimage to Hamburg, Germany, where they got on a ship and came to the United States. My father described how difficult the travel was. My mother, of course, was an infant. She had no recollection of it. The food left a lot to be desired. The bread was hard. When they were lucky, they got the leavings of people in an upper class accommodation. They were in steerage. There were a lot of sick people. He did tell me that when they got to Ellis Island, the Hebrew Ladies Aid Society offered him a banana, and he had never seen a banana before. He didn't know in order to eat it you had to peel it. So he had many, many new experiences when he reached Ellis Island, when he passed the Statue of Liberty, and then coming to Stanford. So I think the way he ended this interview with the reporter was, even without the gold-paved streets, God bless.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a wonderful article to have.
Yes.
And before we leave, you have some other items that I think are of great interest that we should talk about.
I did want to share with you that my grandfather, because his family was so poor in Russia, was apprenticed at a very early age to an artisan who taught him the art of ornamental wrought iron work. And he wound up in Japan, where he also studied it. When the family came to the United States, the Hebrew Ladies Aid Society found them an apartment, and he began walking the street to find a job. He walked for miles until he saw a sign that said they needed people who could build fire escapes. That was his first job. He stayed at that job until his first union meeting. He had to attend once he had been there long enough. They were crowded into a smoke-filled room. Union representatives came on the stage and mandated certain things from the people who were assembled there. My grandfather watched as another attendee got up and questioned one of the edicts. And he said, "Goons from the four corners beat this man to a bloody pulp." He went home and he told my grandmother, Lillian, I'm going back to work tomorrow and I'm going to have to tell a lie. He explained what had happened at the meeting, and he said, I cannot join a union that does this, and I am going to have to tell him that you are sick, and I have to leave my job to take care of you. He opened his own shop. He worked for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Eleanor used to sit in my grandmother's kitchen and have a glace of latte. I met Lily Pons and Andre Castellanets when my grandfather went to plan a massive gate to their Connecticut estate. And I also met Emily Post. And she apparently liked my manners. She inscribed a book, which my children now have. So you'll see a few articles here, pieces that my grandfather made by hand. My mother always wanted to do this. She had a very artistic bent, but daughters didn't do this. That kind of a business was passed on to the sons. So my uncle did it for a short while. But the leaves that you see on the mirror that my grandfather made, my mother had learned how to shape them, and he never let her use the acetylene torch, but he did let her use the other tools of the trade.
Mhm.
So they had an interesting careers.
You showed us an embroidered piece that I think we'd like to
Yes.
talk about. And,
Yes.
got that?
Wrought iron. All of these wrought iron pieces are now anywhere from 85 to 110 years old, handcrafted by my grandfather. The part in here that's not iron is a piece of tile that was given to my grandfather as partial payment during the stock market crash when a customer didn't have money to offer him. And you'll see that in tile on the top of another table that he made, as well as the piece of marble below day. And it's amazing when I think that my mother learned how to create the leaves and the flower petals when she was quite young. The marble top on this table was also payment from a very wealthy customer who had no cash resources anymore once the crash of '29 came about. While you're filming, Julian, this globe was given to us by our children for our 30th anniversary. It was a New York City souvenir globe, and it contains the World Trade Center. There's also a yellow cab in there, which my father drove for years, and the Statue of Liberty and the bridges, and the train, when you wind it up, goes around the track.
You want to give us an explanation?
Yeah, this is a holiday cloth that my mother encouraged me to make 60 years ago. It was spurred on by an idea that the temple had of making a community cloth for the Oneg Shabbats. She decided we should have our own family cloth. And the family selected Kihem Chayenu V'Orech Yomenu. These are our life and the length of our days as the theme of the cloth. And there are representations of Purim, Pesach, Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, children in the Cheder, Jewish scholars, the creation, and
Let's switch this around.
I drew these in pencil, and my mother stitched each and every one of these drawings with a great deal of love and skill. After 60 years, it still moves me just taking it out and remembering how hard she worked on it.
Well, Harriet, it's been a pleasure speaking with you and learning about your family and your life experiences. And we appreciate very much having this information for our archives. And we will have a DVD for you to share with your family. Thank you so much.
Lester, Julian, the pleasure was indeed mine. What a joy to have you here and to relive some things that have been so special in my life.